Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special segment of Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco, and I have here joining me Dack Rouleau of the Overwritten Report and host of his own channel named after him, and Jordan of the Yellow Brick Road. How are you guys doing today?
I'm as perky as a rat in liverwurst. How are you?
I'm doing well.
I'm half asleep. That's right.
So today we're going to be Dack and Jordan are going to be debating which is more effective at installing change. Is it going to be peaceful protests or violent protests? Should we be condemning the violence that's happening right now during these protests for Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd? So Dack is representing which side?
Well, especially after having a visit from the FBI on Tuesday afternoon, I would not say that I condone violence. What I was trying to argue on Twitter is that there is an effort to condemn the violence that's going on in these protests, but I think that effort is somewhat misguided. I think that when people are condemning the violence that they see on the side of the protesters, they're missing the forest for the trees. They're missing the conditions that give rise to those violent actions.
Mm-hmm. And then, Jordan, you're representing which side?
Nonviolence all the way, no matter what, no matter who. Cop, protester, whoever, nonviolence.
So I'll explain how everything will work for this debate. First, I will start by asking you two to each give a 1-minute introduction, and feel free to give any shout outs you like about where people can find you, your Patreons, any other fundraisers of that nature. And then after the introduction, I will explain what we will do next. So who wants to start?
After you.
I'm Jordan from Yellow Brick Road. I mainly just talk shit off the top of my head while watching, social content. You can find me at YellBRo on Twitter or the Yellow Brick Road on YouTube.
And I'm Dack Rouleau, a journalist at overwritten.org. You can find my PayPal there. I have been writing about the decline of the American empire. I also was the only journalist who got about 20 Democratic Party presidential candidates on the record about Julian Assange.
What we'll do next is I will allow you both to give a 5-minute opening statement about your stance, and then you guys can go back and forth for 30 minutes. After which I will ask more specific questions. Each of you have a maximum of 5 minutes before letting the other person speak. I will only interject if someone speaks over someone else, so please respect each other's time. I know you guys will do a really good job at that, so I will let you guys get at it. So whoever wants to start can start, and then just go with the back and forth.
All right, I'll go. All right. Obviously, my stance is nonviolence, no matter what, and that's for, I'd say, several reasons on several different layers. Not only the practical, social reason, which is when cops see any type of violence, looting, riots, anything like that, it gives them the excuse to crack down on peaceful protesters, which we've seen, right? They've been focusing heavily on the nonviolent protesters as opposed to, rioters and stuff and looters, right? You don't really see the cops around there as much as you see the, kids holding signs, screaming stuff, and getting pepper sprayed for it. But my main reason is, I would say, for moral reasons, as in you're not supposed to reflect the character of the people you're going against, your opponents in a way. You're supposed to stand above them. You're supposed to take the moral high ground. And as my last discussion with Israel on this channel, my main focus has always been moral aptitude and moral action, and always working from within that realm. So my main point is protesters should take the moral high ground and stand above the so-called pigs. That's it.
All right. Dack, your response and your opening statement.
Yes. Well, as I wrote in an article at overwritten.org about a couple of months ago, I explained that violence cannot be condoned a priori because we don't know what the end result of a violent situation will be. Say that you and I get into a fist fight. You would think, well, what's the big deal? It's just a fist fight. What's the worst that could happen? But what could happen is an innocent bystander who enters the room could suddenly be caught up in the violence and through no fault of his or her own suffer an injury or possibly even death. That is why violence is not something that we can condone ahead of the fact, because we don't know what the end result will be. However, in these protests that we're seeing all over the country, there has been an effort to condemn the violence in and of itself, to suggest that there is never any value to a violent action. What I'm saying is that the violence that we are seeing provides a striking illustration and an educational opportunity. We can see what the police are doing towards non-violent protesters and learn from that to say, this is what we are up against. It's not to suggest that protesters should antagonize the police or should commit violence against them, but it is to say that this violence provides a striking opportunity for reflection and analysis that probably would not be there if this were all entirely bloodless.
All right, Jordan.
I guess so you're saying that this is an opportunity, like, it's not that you are okay with riots and violence beforehand. It's more of, it's happening anyways, and you want to use it as an opportunity. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at these protests, when you have protests that are completely nonviolent, when no blood is spilled, we very rarely see any kind of meaningful change come out of that. Because if the government knows, or the person you're protesting knows, that you are not going to take physical action, then all they have to do is wait for your demonstration to end before they can go back to the status quo. In this situation, where we are seeing the police brutality in vivid, visceral detail, this shows people who may have been on the fence on this issue, this shows them this is what we are actually up against, and it is convincing in a way that it would not be if the protests were completely bloodless.
Okay, so sort of like a symbol, or content for the masses who normally wouldn't give a shit about any of this if they see just nice, peaceful protesters. Okay. What I would say to that is, well, then we have a problem with peaceful protesters if they're willing to back down at any moment. See, peace, in my mind, what a healthy, peaceful protest based on moral principles is that it's unflinching. It's never moving, and it's not leaving until the goal is achieved. So, cops and governors and mayors and all that backing off and just say, just wait it out, should never be an option for them. They should have to put themselves on the line to where, how we're seeing like Trump supporters heavily focused on like, oh, look, they're looting, look, they're rioting, like them dudes focusing strictly on that. It's like, that will be on the cops' end, because they'll be seen as the rioters and the violent types if a peaceful protest is sustained to its entirety. No backing down, no, I got work on Monday, none of that shit, and obviously would require a lot of people. And that's, that's the tough part, is to get the normies out of bed and get them out there peacefully protesting and with a clear, very clear message, right? Little kids can understand that, oh, this guy's handcuffed, he's not moving, and this dude is continually putting his knee in his neck. Like, little kids would understand, like, there's something wrong with that. You already caught him. What are you doing? So they need to use that unflinching nature of a truly moral, righteous movement.
So when you say non-flinching, you mean in the face of police brutality or violence? That when they right? So that's what you're saying. Okay, you're talking about
anything, whatever it is, peaceful. If the cops are peaceful or if they're cracking heads, you need to. Good.
Yeah, but you keep referring to the idea of non-flinching. They're not backing down, implying that there's some kind of force that is coming at them that would ordinarily cause them to capitulate. And in this case, it would be police brutality or institutional brutality, whether it's the police, military, etc. Is that right?
Not necessarily, because boredom could be a pushback.
Okay.
Feeling like, oh, we're not going to win, that could be a pushback. There's plenty of things that people should stand up against without flinching.
Sure, but the example you gave specifically was the one of George Floyd, where he was not interacting violently with a police officer who had his knee on his neck. And it is that image of non-resistance in the face of violence that you find to be particularly effective, kind of like the Gandhi principle. Is that right?
Well, I don't speak for Gandhi, but
but the same message he was trying to convey. In the face of
on the surface level, yeah, I guess a similar thing.
Okay.
I would say the George Floyd thing is more of what I was putting it is in the context of a signal that something is wrong. Mm-hmm. Like I said, even a little kid could look at that and be like, okay, this isn't right. Something's off with this. So that's the context I put it in.
Right, and the thing that is so objectionable in that is the act of violence. It is the fact that the police officer was putting his knee violently into the neck of a defenseless man that is so poignant and so striking. So in that situation, you need the violent imagery in order to convey your point. And that is where I think people are kind of missing the forest for the trees in with these protests. It's that the image of violence is what is going to inform people on their point, whether they are in favor of the protesters because they are being brutally assaulted by police officers are inflicting violence against them, or if you stand on the side of the police because you see that protesters are being violent towards them. It's the element of violence that is inescapable. It's something that we seem to be unable to get away from, probably because it is a part of nature and life. And so I don't think when we're condemning the violence in and of itself, again, I think we're missing the point that in these situations, in these revolutions, or in these protests, violence is going to come eventually, whether it comes on the part of the protesters or whether it comes on the part of the resisting establishment. It's going to be there. And so when we condemn it, I think instead of saying that it is morally right or wrong, we need to ask ourselves, what are the conditions that are giving rise to this violence? That is the point that I think people should be focusing on.
All right.
Go ahead, Franco.
Oh no, I was saying it. You can respond.
Violence will always. Well, I would say that depends on your sensitivity and definition of violence. Violence doesn't have to mean, hitting someone with a baton or whatever. Violence could be a strict order or a threat. So on and so forth. I'd say there needs to be a clash, but it doesn't have to be physically violent. It does not have to be physically violent. And once again, it requires the majority of the population to be involved in it. Now, I think people would consider that unrealistic based on today's standards. But it has to be done that way in order for you to maintain your character as taking the moral high ground. You cannot give way to looting or rioters. Regardless, you have to place them aside and say they are not us. They're something else. We didn't come here for this thing. And I'm hoping all these peaceful protesters want them out of the way and not involved in what they're doing, not using what they're doing as an excuse for, I don't know, sneaking around the peaceful protest to do stupid shit, in my opinion. Like burning stuff, or robbing stuff, or beating up guys because they say something out loud, or they look weird, or they have a particular skin tone, or whatever.
Well, when I was at the Boston protest on Sunday, there was a young man in the audience who wanted to, or the crowd rather, who wanted to get violent with the police officers. He said he wanted to do something like charge at them. I discouraged him from doing so because I said that that violence would not serve any kind of point. Also, it would not have gone over very well for this young man because he had no defenses. He just had his fists, and he wasn't exactly the brawniest person I ever saw. But the point is, you keep referring to this idea that nonviolent resistance is a moral principle. But in the case of these protests, we see that, for example, the curfew that is set, when people disobey that curfew and they continue to protest after the designated hours, the police officers have, in some cases, responded with violent repression. We just saw the videos that came out of New York City where we saw the police officers stampeding down the alleyway to get rid of the protesters. And again, it is the violent element or the absence of violence that you use to affirm your moral stance. What I'm saying is that without that violent element in the first place, you would not have a definition of your moral position. I mean, the reason that people are getting up in arms over this issue of police brutality or police violence is because George Floyd suffered a violent death at the hands of a police officer, or at the knee of a police officer. If this had been a matter of him just being detained in a jail cell unjustly for a couple of hours, something tells me we wouldn't have seen these massive protests. And so, again, I think it's that because society is in a position where we take inconsistent stances on the use of violence, that is what gives rise to this anger in people that eventually culminates in violent action. I mean, I don't think you can say that violence is inherently immoral because, of course, there is violence as self-defense. I'm not saying in this specific instance, but if somebody is breaking into your house and intends to murder you, you obviously have the moral right to defend yourself by any means necessary. And if that includes violence, then so be it. So I don't think you are inherently opposed to violence. I think that you are opposed to violence in this particular instance.
I would say, yes, violence is, it's a neutral, I would call it something that's neutral. And what I mean by that is how it's used is your intention behind using it is the moral dictator in that scenario. So, like something like boxing or UFC, very violent, but obviously I don't call that immoral or evil or whatever. But we're talking about this particular context, which is people's reaction to another form of, or someone else partaking in violence. But once again, you add the context into that scenario, which is a guy who's he's on the ground, he's taken down, he's handcuffed, and they still put his knee on his neck and killed him. So the context matters, the intention matters. Now I put the intention in the realm of, like, he killed him, like he straight up just killed that dude. Whether he had a moment of rage or it's a lot more premeditated, who knows? I don't know. They said they knew each other or something. I heard someone talking about that. Yeah. But either way, like, that was definitely a killing by my understanding. Now, obviously, you would need a more evidence than just me looking at a video, but the context matters in regards to violence. And right now, we're talking about how do we get something done? How do we, as protesters, standing against the quote-unquote police state or the state or whatever, how do we get what we want achieved, and in that context, violence is not the way to go. Because it would be in the realm of revenge or I don't know, rage, anger. You'd be reflecting what that cop did, in my opinion. So.
Right, and the reason why people are turning towards spontaneous and perhaps even illogical violence as a form of protest is because we have an irrational, unphilosophical society. I don't know how many people were marching with me in Boston. I heard reports of as many as like 9,000. But the reason why it was troubling to me was because in talking to some of those people, you could see that the vast majority of them did not actually have a solid or developed political philosophy. You could see that these were people who were responding emotionally to an act of injustice that, as you say, even a child could understand. But if they were to be given power, if they were to seize the reins of power from the state, they would not be able to administer justice appropriately because they lack that philosophical discipline and grounding. Now, that is why I don't condone the violence that we're seeing taking place here, but you cannot deny that there are an infinite number of examples of violent actions throughout history that have served as some kind of moral or philosophical instruction. The example Nietzsche gives is that the Roman state tried to silence Jesus by killing him, and it had the ironic result of creating a religion that has lasted for 2 millennia and will continue to last for much longer than that. So violence in that instance, we can condemn the violence that the Romans inflicted on Jesus, but at the same time, what is Christian iconography? We see the crucifix used constantly, the symbol of the violence that was inflicted against Jesus. It's similar to what Socrates says about immoral people who try to take advantage of other people's moral stances in order to accomplish their own ends. They're still using morality to accomplish their goals. And so I think the same is happening here, that with violence, it serves as an educational tool for an ultimately primitive human species, because we are still so undeveloped intellectually compared to what we could be in the future that people respond only with violence. I look at the violence and I don't condemn it outright. What I do is I ask myself, how is this an educational opportunity? What does this outburst of violence say about the state of our society?
Yeah, but you were saying that it would be present regardless, correct?
I said it's present in nature regardless. I mean, I don't think we're going to get to the point where we can educate the animals not to kill each other. You know, we're not going to convince the lion to stop pursuing the antelope, you know. It's a part of nature, and sometimes you have to use violence as a form of self-defense, as I said earlier. So when people say that they object to violence as an abstract principle, I don't think that that's completely honest.
Okay. I would say I hear what you're saying in regards to, in a way, like violence serving some form of purpose in nature and development and education. But that's not the perspective we're coming from, right? Because that would be a hindsight scenario, correct? Rather than a foresight.
Well, I always said I don't condone violence a priori, meaning in foresight. I can't say that if you throw a brick at that store or you burn the police station, you're going to accomplish your goal, because you probably won't. But what I'm saying is that if it's not a question for me of should people do it. It's a question of why are people doing it. If they're doing it, that indicates that there's something wrong with society in its present form. So it's kind of like gauging the temperature of a sick patient, as it were.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that. Well, yeah, I agree with that. And as far as the because we're talking about protesters right now in regards to the violent aspects. Yes, it would signal something's wrong in society, and I mean, I've been ready to move on to solutions in regards to the society itself, right? Because I've been saying this all day on Twitter in regards to police officers. Like, they are just people, you know. They're not special. They're not aliens. They're not saints. They're us. They're people. They're people, just in a different scenario that took a different life path.
Yeah, people with uniforms. I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So the psychological things happening with the protesters and rioters and looters. Well, let me throw the peaceful protesters, push them to the side there. With rioters and looters, I'm sure something similar psychologically is happening with these violent police officers, the violent ones in particular. I would say there's some sort of commonality in regards to how their psyche is behaving. Now, if we can understand this psychological thing, this would give you a tiny view of foresight in regards to like who should not be here, which protesters should not be here, because these guys like are willing to, they're ready to throw bricks and light shit on fire. And the same thing with the police officers, who should not be here. I think there's some sort of something you can observe prior to them doing the violent action, if you will. And that's on society to start recognizing. And it starts by studying your own psyche, I would say.
Yes. Well, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that if everybody in society was psychologically healthy, then we wouldn't have law enforcement, because those institutions would just gradually crumble and fade away, not because of any kind of violent revolution, but because there just wouldn't be a demonstrable need for those kinds of services or programs. Now, yes. Now, in the context of these protests, I think there's another mistake, which is to condemn the protesters as a homogenous entity. The people who are throwing the bricks at the storefronts or lighting the police stations on fire, I mean, first of all, we don't even know who those people are. There are plenty of conspiracy theories out there suggesting that is a false flag operation carried out by the state. I'm not saying that that's true, but I am saying it's possible.
Oh, they're cops. They're cops.
It could be. I actually discussed that with the police officers and the FBI agent who came to my house this week, and they were obviously not supportive of the conspiracy theory. But certainly there's room for it. But
I don't mean cops. I mean like I said, the psychological. If I had like a meter that could read their psychological energy, if you will, they might resemble some of these cops out there. Thus, they're cops. They might as well be cops.
Right. The same sadistic drive that inspires somebody to take up a position of power. Like, for example, a lot of people go into the field of corrections because they want to be able to bully people. There's that kind of like brutal psyche at work there. I agree. But if we go back to what happened on last Sunday in Boston, I was in that crowd, and there was at least one person in the crowd who wanted to get violent with the police officers, but I discouraged that person from doing so. So you can't say that the protesters as a homogenous entity have control over what every single person in the group is doing. One person throwing a brick does not equal a trend. So condemning the protests outright because some faction within it engages in violence is, again, missing the forest for the trees. I don't think it's right to do that, and that's why I've been critical of Cassandra Fairbanks, who has been she's been painting these protests with a very broad brush.
Yes, but I agree with you. Not to lump everyone together, but we do need to make those diagnoses, those evaluations in regards to like a true peaceful protester, like you were talking about, like if everyone in the world was healthy, there would be no need for a police and state and all of that. Those types of peaceful protesters are even separated from the protesters who want to do violence or want to do something, but they have either society or fear or something like that that stops them from doing that. And then the next layer of the people who actually just go ahead and do it. Once again, the people who are fighting their own minds to stay peaceful should not be there either. And once again, that would narrow it down by quite a bit, right? Because I'd say a lot of them, from protesters to looters to rioters to police, a lot of them are intellectually like children. They see like if someone punches them, their next reaction is like, I have to hit them back, or something like that. And those minds, they probably should not be there either. It's a thing where we have to fix the society on a psychological level, not a person going in and fixing them. I mean, they need to fix themselves psychologically in order for anything to get better. Because if we have children dealing with children, or children versus children, we're not really going to get anywhere. Right. So those core, real, peaceful protesters, those are the ones that I think should obviously receive the most attention and be the loudest. But unfortunately, we have children versus children and children watching children versus children, right? They're focusing on oh, look, this guy got his head cracked. Or look, this guy ran over a police officer, right? Uh-huh. So this is obviously the solution lies somewhere deeper than the scenario we're even looking at.
All right, so Dack, you'll get the last response, and then I'll ask the next specific question.
Right, and that's why I said earlier that these people who are not particularly developed philosophically, it would be a mistake for them to lead a violent revolution because, of course, once they have the reins of power, they would not be able to execute those powers responsibly. They would just create another situation.
Would it be a mistake for anyone to lead a violent revolution?
Well, again,
I thought the violence would put them in child territory, from the jump already.
Well, it depends. I mean, if you have a situation where the state as an abstract entity is inherently resistant to any form of change, then that raises questions about how you can work within the system, if you even can. I don't endorse violence a priori just because you don't know what the consequences are going to be. And so that's why replacing one dictatorship with another is never a worthwhile strategy. But at the same time, we can see how, for example, in Cuba, when Castro came into power, there were definitely innocent bystanders who were hurt along the way. But at the same time, what he created in Cuba was preferable to the system that had existed beforehand. And the reason he felt that he had to adopt those means to achieve those ends is because obviously the government that had existed previously was never going to allow any of the institutional changes that he desired. Obviously, the government was not going to end the practice of Western businesses corrupting the society and looting the treasury. So when you're in that situation where it's absolutely impossible to have any kind of civil reformation, that is where your principle of nonviolence, no matter what, at the very least, it comes into question. Again, I'm not condoning anybody going out and committing an act of violence. What I'm saying is that if the system is designed in a way to make change quite literally impossible, then that raises questions about what people are supposed to do.
All right.
Yeah,
sorry, Jordan, you can.
That?
You
is
can
it not more violence as the winner? I'm just saying, isn't that... Because I say this thing about wars quite often. When we have these, some evil empire that's ruling over the world with fucking swords and shields and all that shit, and then a small group that slowly builds up its resistance and finally beats the evil empire, who's, in my mind, who's the real winner of that? it's telling everyone in their psyche, in their mind, that war is the winner. That the only way to get shit done is through violent uprisings or war or whatever. My army versus your army. I think it sends something in the psyche that way.
I know that Franco wanted to move to the questions, but I'll just make this very, very brief response to what you just said, which is that, again, we are in a state of relative intellectual primitivism where at this point, I don't know how likely it is for us to organize a movement comprised explicitly of people who are basically scholars. I mean, I think that, again, we see these mass protests taking place, and there are a lot of people in there who really don't know what they're talking about, but nevertheless, we welcome them into the group because it helps to illustrate the popular sentiment that they have. This is why there's been controversy about should white people be allowed to participate in the protest. Well, the obvious answer is yes, because it indicates that you have popular support that goes beyond your particular niche. And so that's why in this situation, you kind of take the support that you can get rather than try to be completely disciplined intellectually. But I know that Franco wants to move on to another subject.
Yeah, this relates to...
Real quick.
Sure, I won't respond, so just go ahead.
You don't need scholars. You need moral intelligence, and I've defined that with my debate with Israel. Not in detail, but I put that.
This next question relates to what you guys were discussing just now about the psyche and our current state of collective consciousness, and that question is our evolution into higher collective consciousness something to consider, and whether we should continue or abandon violent protests?
Well, I think that we need to question the intellectual evolution of the human race. Right now I'm reading a really interesting book called The Making of Counterculture by Theodore Roszak, where he mounts a very convincing criticism of the technocracy. And for those who are not familiar with it, technocracy does not refer to technological advancement necessarily. It's a subject that I can't really get into right now because it would take us down a huge rabbit hole. But what he's suggesting is that perhaps the human race is not necessarily becoming more refined or becoming stronger intellectually. It's just limiting itself within a facade of formality. And so in the context of a violent protest, again, as I've said previously in this video, my initial reaction is not to make a moral assessment of the protests or the violent protest to say whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. My instinct is to ask, what does this say about the society at present? You saw this in the French Revolution, where obviously there were some innocent people killed during those student protests. But again, what were they responding to? They were responding to something that was problematic. And it was, in this case, the abuses of the Napoleonic government. We see that here in the case of George Floyd, is that regardless of how much we want to focus on the bad actors in the protest, that is not going to negate the fact that we have this problem, this institutional problem of police brutality, the abuse of power by agents of the state. And so in that context, that, I think, is where our priorities ought to be. I don't think that it's helpful to focus on the violence of the protests. We need to ask, what are they responding to? And so that, again, so is the intellectual evolution of humanity something to take into consideration? Absolutely. It's also something that needs to be questioned.
I don't think it takes, in regards to, you put it in terms of the collective conscious, right? And the way to, as far as how that is to evolve or grow or whatever, I think it's fairly simple, but also difficult because of the, I guess you can call them mental blockers, the social conditioning, the collective conditioning of the ego. In regard, it would be difficult for someone to take like my definition of moral intelligence and really apply that into life, right? If they look at me and they say, okay, some guy on YouTube. Now, that brings in the social conditioning of, okay, where's your PhD? What school did you go to? What grades did you get in school? Who knows you? What's your family like? So in order to really move the collective conscious forward in what I would consider a moral way, those barriers need to be knocked down a bit. And I try to do that with simple, understandable definitions of simple applications of morality, which I call moral intelligence. It's very simple. You just take, what do you know about the world, and what is your intention with that knowledge, right? Something simple like fire burns, right? Knowledge of the world, fire burns. Now, what's your intention? Do I mean well with other people, or do I not mean well with other people? And it's something simple like that even a child could do, that we can start applying to when we observe other people, and obviously observe ourselves. And using that will help us recognize in other people, like, oh, okay, I see why this is not a good thing. This is not good. Considering whether it's the police officers or the rioters or the violent protest people, you can at least recognize that. Even just the simplest mind could recognize that and stand against it. And thus, collective conscious, I guess, evolution or growing or whatever you want to call it.
If I could just make a real quick response to that, what you said about people focusing on these kind of ornaments of social achievement, like the grades you got in high school, the degrees you have, things like that, that is the technocracy that Theodore Roszak is critiquing. And I think he also makes a very good point in his book when he mentions the civil rights protests that were taking place in the 1960s. We obviously haven't moved beyond that. He was pointing out that there's a question about what is the ultimate value if the civil rights groups achieve their goal. If Black Americans now get to enjoy the bourgeois comforts that are enjoyed by middle-class whites, have they really accomplished anything, or have they merely been absorbed within that corrupting system? This is obviously a big reason why we don't see the Democratic Party as a force for good, because it doesn't it doesn't change the corrupting institutions that we're looking to destroy. It just welcomes more people of color into the ranks. And so with these protests, I agree with you that we need to have this higher consciousness within human beings. I haven't seen a whole lot of that in the protests, speaking of the protests that I personally attended, not just the footage I've watched on Twitter. I don't think that the problem of political ignorance and unphilosophical meandering among the American people generally, I don't think that problem was solved on the night that we decided to launch these protests. That's why I think the protests are ultimately ill-fated. But you'll notice that has nothing to do with their violent nature. It's not the violence that's the issue here. It's the lack of a knowledgeable foundation that's the issue.
Yeah, but the lack of that knowledgeable foundation causes the... Okay, all right, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, violence is just one particular... The violence is just one particular problem that arises from that condition. Again, it's what the conditions give rise to that's the issue. Yeah.
Yes, agreed. But, yeah, agreed. And in regards to... And that falls on the side of the protesters and the police officers and the state and everyone watching. They all fall into I'd say damn near everyone falls into that category of, I'd say, stepping it up a notch, increasing their, just even increasing their philosophical understanding of the world. and their moral philosophy on the world, and just looking at right and wrong. It's not considered enough, and it should be considered a lot more than it has been, I would say.
Sure.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's the FBI.
It's the FBI.
Called the FBI.
All right. Yeah. So.
Outside talking. All right, good.
So I can. I guess we can ask the next question. For this, you guys can also have like a back and forth for like about 20 minutes. So humans, we're social creatures. We've evolved to have all these social norms and rules, and we also respond in ways to protect our survival. Is survival what molds our perspective of what is moral? Is morality subjective or is it objective?
I would consider morality objective. Now, I consider it objective internally amongst individuals. Each one of us internally has a moral code that we're living by, and that is where the objectivity lies. Yes, that sounds contradictory, right? That sounds like subjectivity if we're all individually coming up with certain things, but I take a moral barometer, like my moral barometer is intention. Like, what do you mean to do? Do I mean to do well or do I not mean to do well? And that is in the realm, and that is objective. I would consider that each one of us collectively, that is objective. Our intentions are objective. Now, when someone's trying to view it from the outside, that's where we start viewing it as something subjective, right? Because of our information with the world. It's the information and the ego attached to that intention that turns it into something subjective. Like, I don't know, some people think eating dogs is okay, some people don't. That's the ego attachment, but what is the intention behind that? Is it I'm just feeding myself? Like am I just feeding myself versus someone saying, I just want to protect dogs, right? Their intention is to mean well, but the egotistical content attached to it is when it starts becoming, this is now a subjective matter, right? This person believes this person believes that, but the intention is the objective thing that I think should be focused on. What was the other parts of your question? Please say that again.
Is our like hardwired drive to protect our survival what molds our perspective of what's moral?
Does our need for survival drive our morality? I would say it's tough because it's going to get into woo-woo land. I'm trying not to go there as far as my understanding of the metaphysical nature of people. That's where I want to go. But I'll put it this way. What's the point of surviving? Why do we try to survive? We try to survive in order to live. Well, why do we live? We live for expression. We want to express ourselves. We want to be ourselves, and that is the main focus. I'm still trying not to go to woo-woo land, but the soul or the self, express ourselves. What is that self thing? That's the exact same layer. That's the exact same place where intention is at, and that is where the objective morality is at. Now, I would say what drives us morally is not strictly survival. It's intention, right? Because as far as moral intelligence goes, right, our intention plus our knowledge of the world Now, if all we understand is when someone is hurt, or like we understand what pain is, we understand that if we, shoot someone in the head and they go limp and they're like, oh, they're not there anymore. That's our understanding of it. It's like, oh, what is your intention behind that, right? What is your intention behind that? So if I understand, shit, I'm fucking this up right now. There's so much fucking concepts I'm thinking of right now.
It's 30 seconds.
Right, so if we understand that people with their intentions, which are objective, if their understanding of the world is that when shot in the head, someone goes limp, they go dead, like they're not there anymore, that's what is driving the moral attachment to it.
All right.
That's what's driving the moral attachment to it, is that people understand a dead body as someone not there anymore, meaning they don't exist anymore, which means you're eliminating their existence. Thus, morally, I would never intend to do that to someone, because our understanding of it is that they go away, they disappear, they're gone now. Same thing with violence. If my intention is to mean well, how could I hurt someone? Because I understand pain. My knowledge of the world of pain, my egotistical conditioning of what pain is and what it feels like, I am now attaching it to someone else. I'm placing it onto someone else, which I don't see how someone could intend to do well with that, unless there's a lack of, worldly understanding, or a lack of self-understanding, even. But go ahead, I'm like fucking this up. Go ahead.
Well, I would actually have to disagree with pretty much everything you just said. And go back to the beginning of, is morality objective? Morality is absolutely not objective. And in fact, I tend to agree with Nietzsche, who said that there is no such thing as a moral or immoral action. There is only a moral evaluation of an action. You define morality as an objective concept because you say that it's defined by people's desire to do well. But the problem is that people can define wellness subjectively. Is doing well, does that mean doing well unto others, or does it mean doing well unto yourself? Are there situations where doing well for others may come at your own expense, or vice versa? If doing well unto others and harming yourself means to support a group of, as you describe it, immoral people, then obviously you would not do that. That would be immoral. You gave the example of people eating meat. Is the killing of animals for meat immoral? Well, that proves it right there that morality cannot be objective, because people take different positions on that. Traditional Christian morality states that it is okay to devour those animals because it comes into the service of the higher being of humanity, but the Buddhists obviously take a different perspective. You ask, how can you do well or mean to do well by hurting somebody? Well, if it's a situation where there is a person who walks into if you have a violent person, like say there's a mass shooter in a room, harming that mass shooter could be doing well unto the people around you. It goes back into the concept of violence being inherently disagreeable, a notion with which I disagree. The original question, though, was in addition to the objectivity of morality, does the drive for survival form our morality? I would say that what people define as morality, they ultimately mean the health of the human species. Obviously, the survival of the species pertains to the health of the species, or vice versa. But that is only if we don't define morality on those grounds, then the question is answered completely differently. As Jordan has been saying, this is not the time or the place to go into the metaphysics or the existential philosophy of the subject. But I don't agree with the notion. I certainly cannot agree with the notion that morality is objective. This is not really the time to defend Nietzsche's concept that morality is a fiction, but certainly we can agree that morality is, or we can determine right now that morality is not objective, because your stance on killing animals for meat might be different from mine.
Yeah, but those were the ego attachments that I spoke of. I know my words were all like clouded and all over the place. But
what do you mean by ego attachments?
Well, once again, trying to stay away from the. I mean, I'm trying. It's hard not to in regards to what I define as the self or the soul, whatever word you want to put on it. But the ego is the. I would call it the negotiator of content, both external content and internal content. Internal meaning like emotional or deeper psychological, like the subconscious and all that. But it also the ego also negotiates external content, which is what are my senses feeling, what am I seeing, hearing, smelling, all that, taste. So when I say ego attachment, I mean content that is pressed into the ego, but not necessarily a blatant direct connection with the self, what I would consider the self. That is where the intention is at, and that's what makes it objective. Like, what do I mean to do? What do I mean to do is not is not defined as dog, eating dog or not. That's not where that realm is. The self's realm is just, what do I mean to do with the content I have, the content that's placed in the ego. What do I mean to do with the content in my ego?
And you say that what people always mean to do is to do well. But, that's what you said earlier. But that's how you said you prove that morality is objective, because everyone is trying to do well.
No, not everyone's trying to do well. Well, yes and no. It's going to go in the woo-woo land. In regards to the self, if the self is detached from the ego, then there is no way of meaning well, because the self is where the meaning well happens. So if my actions are detached from myself or soul or whatever the frick you want to call it, if my actions, my ego, right, the negotiator that deals with the external content, right, if that's detached from what I call the self or soul or whatever, then the action can lack meaning well. And that's how I put it. Lack of meaning well, as opposed to meaning harm or whatever. Good.
But weren't you advocating for the detachment of the ego from the self? Weren't you saying that was what would guide humanity in a better direction?
When did I say that?
I know, I was asking, isn't that what you were trying to say? Because what you said initially was that you say that morality is objective because people invariably mean to do well. It's just that the definition of well is varying. And
no.
Okay, so can you try again?
The meaning well is not. That's not the difference in content. Like, it's okay to eat dogs versus it's not okay to eat dogs. That's not the meaning well part. The meaning well is the self on its own, like the intention of meaning well, and then you add content to it. The ego adds content to it, and it attaches to it, to where you can have a society where eating dogs is okay versus a society where eating dogs is wrong, right? It's I mean to do well, but my social egotistical conditioning says eating dogs is okay or eating dogs is wrong. The meaning well, strictly the meaning well is where the objective morality is. That is the barometer. Everything else is ego attachments. Does that make any more sense?
Well, I guess, but again, we can define well subjectively. I mean, what is doing well unto you might be different from doing what is well unto me.
That's the content. That's the content. That's the ego conditioned to define this as meaning well, or to define that as meaning well.
So
but the meaning well itself.
Okay.
Once again, if I wanted to define this further, I'd go, deeper into, I guess, metaphysics, if you would.
But if so, doing the drive to do well, is that the objective morality that you're referring to?
Yeah, I guess you can call it that. I call it the barometer of.
But again, that definition is incomplete because you haven't explained if doing well to whom. Whom does it benefit? Does it benefit the individual or does it benefit society? How do you define what benefits society? This is why I can't get on board with the idea that morality is objective. I mean, like the example you keep giving of eating dogs, it's a perfect example, is that people would have their own particular assessment of whether or not that is really doing well. Is that
based on what, human beings? Based on what would make eating a dog good or bad, and whatever. Like, what's the dictator of that?
Well, you're defining the dictator or the barometer as doing well, but you haven't explained who is the beneficiary of this act of wellness.
I would say in regards to benefit, it's not really that. It's more of an expression. It's a self-expression, as opposed to. I know the word meaning well might be throwing you off a bit, but
yeah,
what I'm calling morality, what I'm calling as the objective aspect of morality, the barometer of it is intentions, and. Yes. Putting the word meaning well on it might be the thing that's throwing you off here, but for understanding what I mean by it. But
I think I understand what you're saying. You're saying that you're defining morality by the drive to improve. But the question is, improve what? Like, if a person may say that accumulating wealth is a moral action, even if it comes at the expense of others. But then plenty of other people have the opposite view. So that's why I don't believe that morality can ever be considered truly objective, because there are so many variables in the content, as you put it. And so the drive to do well, I understand what you're saying, that there's sort of a uniform drive for betterment. But because betterment has to be defined, morality becomes subjective, not necessarily right at the gate, but the first step out of the gate, morality becomes subjective.
Once again, going back, all right, when I say the self or whatever means well, it's more of and you bring up beneficiary. I'm tying that to it's a beneficiary to everything. The self is the entirety of everything. I would say mushed together, if you will, meaning you're seeing yourself in another person. So the intention of mean well, I guess you could call it a beneficiary of everything, but I would just call it expression, self-expression, See, I'm trying to stay away from terms like do good, but that'll muddy the waters even more if I say that, right? So, but like you said, with the wealthy man, to obtain wealth or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. I'm considering that meaning well, right? Is that how you put it?
I thought that was how you put it. I was just following off of your definitions.
Well, when I'm saying objective morality, I'm putting it on an internal basis, right? Okay. Now, if we start bringing it towards the external, that's when my definition of moral intelligence comes back into play, right? The objective nature, the objective self of, or the objective part of meaning well, right, internally, now being expressed through layers of the psyche and the world outside of me. And now my moral intention is, how much do I understand about the world, plus do I mean well? Meaning, if I take the wealthy guy and his intention is to mean well, right? Not just for himself, but for everyone, right?
Yeah.
now, if he doesn't understand that him obtaining so much amounts of wealth is leaving someone else poor and out to dry, right? And if he understands that not having food is painful, you understand that causes pain, well, then he wouldn't be able to do that while claiming to mean well. You see what I'm saying?
I do. I think this is. I think I would like for this to be my last word on this subject. I would say that I understand what you're saying, that there is the internal mechanism that is inevitably affected by external stimuli or content, as you put it. But again, because we haven't defined doing well, because doing well can be subjective, there's a difference between self-interest versus benevolence or altruism. Because there's ambiguity and room for disagreement on that point, that to me would prove that morality cannot be objective. But I think I'm getting the impression that Franco kind of wanted to go on to a different topic of conversation.
I was gonna actually say that I want to have you guys back to further discuss this subject matter, because I think you guys are seeing the same thing, but you're having trouble conceptualizing it. And we can talk more after this, but because I'm gonna run out of space on my phone here real quick. But
okay,
this is definitely an important topic to discuss, and I do want to have you guys back on if you guys are interested in discussing this further.
Sure.
But do you guys can now each give for 2 minutes your closing statements, going back to more focused protests and all that. So yeah, just give your 2-minute closing statements, and I thank you guys both for coming on. You guys kept it very civil. I thank you guys both for coming on, and everybody else, please not only subscribe to Frank Analysis, but subscribe to Dack Rouleau's channel and subscribe to the Yellow Brick Road with Jordan. So go ahead. Who wants to start with their closing statements?
I'll let you go ahead.
So yeah, if you're listening to this right now, you probably heard a whole bunch of word salad, and there's a reason for that, because this stuff is, I would say, pretty complicated. And trying to put it into words as to why I truly feel that the protests need to remain nonviolent. We've questioned, is violence itself wrong? Is there such thing as wrong? We've questioned these things. My stance is, considering the context of the world we live in and what we're doing here, violence would be wrong, and yes, I do believe there is a wrong. So no one's opinion can be wholeheartedly shifted by this conversation. I hope it wouldn't. I'd hope you think about it more. But I'm just throwing that out there of consider if there is a moral high ground here and try to live by that. Is there something that separates you, the protester, from the police? Is there something that you, random cop, that can make you be better than your fellow cops? Consider these things and hopefully act on them.
Well, I'll have another quote from Nietzsche. Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster. And when you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. That, of course, is a lesson that people should bear in mind when they go to these protests, that they do not want to become the violent, tyrannical, authoritarian bullies that they seek to remove from power. Which is, again, for clarification, especially for any law enforcement agents who might be paying attention to this video, I do not condone violence. But I do say that in these situations where violence occurs, our compulsion should be not to condemn or to assign a moral qualification or a value to the violent protest, but to ask ourselves, what are the social conditions that give rise to these violent outbursts? In this situation, I would say that it is because of a perception that institutional reform, structural reform, or approved methods of reformation have been deemed invalid by the people in the protest. They believe that we have tried every single legislative and judicial trick in the book over the last several centuries to try to resolve this racial tension in the United States, and lacking any perceived remedy through civil means, people have turned to brute force to try to accomplish their goal. Obviously, this is going to be any success they get from this will be invariably short-lived, particularly in this context where they do not have the requisite manpower or firepower to seize control of the state. But nevertheless, I think that condemning them cuts the conversation short. There's a better conversation to be had about why these social conditions have emerged and why we're seeing this come out before us. That is where I think our focus ought to be.
All right, there you have it, folks. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this special episode of Franc Analysis. And don't forget to stay informed. Thanks for watching that segment of Hear Me Out. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell down below so you can get the latest on sports, pop culture, and progressive politics. Stay informed.